The blade went in cold between his shoulders, and the shock of it drove Frank Nolan to his knees in the howling snowstorm, his breath coming out in ragged gasps that turned to white mist in the freezing air. He had been tracking the horse thieves for 3 days across the winter plains of Iowa, and he never saw the ambush coming through the blinding white curtain of snow that swirled around Council Bluffs like a vengeful spirit. The year was 1878, and winter had come early and merciless to the Missouri River Valley. Frank tried to reach behind him, his gloved fingers fumbling for the handle of whatever had pierced through his heavy wool coat, but his strength was already fading. He could hear boots crunching away through the snow, laughter fading into the wind, and then there was nothing but the endless howl of the blizzard and the red stain spreading across the white ground beneath him. He did not know how long he knelt there, swaying like a tree about to fall, but then there were different footsteps, lighter and quicker, and a woman's voice cutting through the storm. "Oh God, oh no, can you hear me?" Frank tried to answer but only managed a groan. Strong hands gripped his shoulders, steadying him, and the voice came again, closer now. "I am going to help you. Stay with me. My cabin is just over that rise." He wanted to tell her about the knife, about the blade still lodged in his back, but darkness was creeping in at the edges of his vision. He felt himself being pulled upward, an arm wrapping around his waist, and then they were moving through the snow. Each step sent fire shooting through his body, but the woman beside him did not falter. She was strong, stronger than her slight frame suggested, and she half carried, half dragged him through drifts that came up to their knees. The cabin appeared like a miracle through the white veil, a small structure of rough-hewn logs with smoke trickling from a stone chimney. The woman kicked the door open and pulled him inside, and the sudden absence of wind felt like a blessing even as Frank collapsed onto the wooden floor. "Stay awake," the woman commanded, and Frank forced his eyes open to look at her properly for the first time. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with dark hair plastered to her face from snow and exertion. Her eyes were a startling shade of green, bright with determination and fear in equal measure. "My name is Emma Norton. What is yours, Frank?" he managed through gritted teeth. "Frank Nolan." Emma was already moving, pulling off her wet coat and rolling up the sleeves of her dress. She knelt beside him, and her face went pale when she saw the knife handle protruding from between his shoulder blades. "Sweet Jesus, who did this to you, horse thieves?" Was tracking them from Council Bluffs. Frank could feel his consciousness slipping again. "They ambushed me. Well, they are gone now, and you are here with me." Emma's voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I need to get this blade out and stitch you up, but it is going to hurt worse than anything you have ever felt. Do you understand?" Frank nodded weakly. He had been shot twice in his 27 years. Once by a drunk card player in Omaha and once by a cattle rustler down in Kansas. But he had never been stabbed before. The cold had numbed some of the pain, but now that he was inside by the fire, feeling was returning to his body with vengeance. Emma disappeared from his line of sight, and he heard her rummaging through cupboards, the clink of glass bottles, the snap of fabric tearing. When she returned, she had a bottle of whiskey-clean cloths, a needle, and what looked like fishing line. She set everything down beside him and took a deep breath. "I am going to turn you on your side first," she said. "Then I will cut away your coat and shirt so I can see the wound properly." She was gentle but firm as she rolled him, and Frank bit back a scream as the movement jostled the blade. Emma worked quickly with scissors, cutting through the layers of wool and cotton until his back was exposed to the warm cabin air. He felt her fingers probe around the wound, felt her sharp intake of breath. "It is between your ribs," she said quietly. If I pull it straight out, you might bleed to death before I can stitch you. But if I leave it in, you will die anyway from infection or from the blade shifting deeper." "Pull it," Frank said. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. "Better to die fighting than waiting." Emma nodded and positioned herself. "On 3. 1, 2. She pulled on 2, and the blade slid free with a wet sound that Frank would remember for the rest of his life. Blood gushed hot down his side, and Emma was there immediately with the cloths, pressing down hard to staunch the flow. The pain was white-hot and overwhelming, and Frank finally let himself scream, the sound echoing off the cabin walls. "Stay with me," Emma said fiercely. She poured whiskey directly into the wound, and Frank nearly passed out from the burning agony. "I know it hurts, but I need you conscious." "Talk to me, Frank. Tell me about yourself." "Not much to tell," Frank gasped out. The pressure of her hands on his back was immense. "Deputy Marshal, work out of Council Bluffs, been tracking those bastards for 3 days. Are you married?" "No." "Good," Emma said, and there was something in her voice that might have been relief if Frank had been in any state to notice. "Hold still now. I am going to start stitching." The needle pierced his flesh, and Frank grabbed onto the leg of the nearby table, his knuckles going white. Emma worked with surprising skill, her stitches neat, and even despite the blood and the poor light from the fire. As she worked, she talked, her voice becoming a lifeline that kept him anchored to consciousness. "I have been living here alone for 2 years, she said. "My husband died of pneumonia the winter after we were married. This was his hunting cabin about 5 miles outside of town. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go and no money to get there anyway. I trap rabbits and squirrels, trade pelts in Council Bluffs for supplies. It is not much of a life, but it is mine. You are good at this," Frank managed. "The stitching. My mother was a midwife. She taught me to sew up wounds before she passed." Emma tied off another stitch, and Frank felt her pause to wipe blood away. "We lived in Pennsylvania when I was young. Came west with my husband in 1874, thought we would make our fortune. Instead, I became a widow at 22. Frank wanted to say something comforting, but another wave of pain crashed over him as she continued her work. He focused on breathing, on staying conscious, on the sound of her voice. Time became strange and fluid. At some point, the stitching stopped, and Emma was wrapping his torso in clean bandages torn from what must have been her spare linens. "Done," she finally said, and Frank heard the exhaustion in her voice. "You have lost a lot of blood, but if infection does not set in, you might just live through this." She helped him roll onto his side, then onto his stomach on a pile of blankets she had laid out by the fire. Frank's whole body was shaking, from shock and blood loss and cold that seemed to have settled into his very bones. Emma covered him with more blankets, then a heavy bearskin that smelled of cedar and smoke. "Sleep now," she said softly. "I will keep the fire going and check on you through the night." Frank wanted to thank her, wanted to ask why she had risked herself to save a stranger in a blizzard, but sleep was pulling him down into darkness, and he could not fight it any longer. He woke to gray morning light filtering through the cabin's single window, and the smell of coffee boiling on the stove. Every inch of his body ached, but the sharp agony in his back had dulled to a throbbing pain that was almost bearable. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. "Easy," Emma said, appearing at his side. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes and her hair tangled around her shoulders. "You need to stay still for at least a few days or you will tear the stitches." "How long was I out?" "All night and half the morning. It is past 10. She helped him shift so he could drink from a tin cup of water, supporting his head with surprising tenderness. "The storm has not let up. We are snowed in for now." Frank drank gratefully, then managed to look around the cabin properly. It was small but well maintained, with a narrow bed in one corner, a cooking stove, a table and 2 chairs, and shelves lined with supplies and trapping equipment. A rifle hung over the door and snowshoes leaned against the wall. It was the home of someone who had learned to survive alone in hard country. "You saved my life," Frank said when Emma set the cup aside. "I do not know how to thank you for that." Emma shrugged, but he caught the flush that colored her cheeks. "I could not leave you to die out there." "What kind of person would that make me? A practical one by frontier standards. You did not know me. I could have been one of those thieves for all you knew." "You were not," Emma said simply. She stood and went to pour herself coffee. "I saw your badge when I cut away your clothes. Besides, you have an honest face." Frank almost laughed, but it hurt too much. "Most outlaws I have arrested would disagree with you." Over the next 3 days, Frank remained confined to his makeshift bed by the fire while Emma tended to him with a care that went beyond simple frontier hospitality. She changed his bandages twice a day, cleaning the wound with boiled water and checking for signs of infection. She fed him soup made from dried venison and root vegetables, helped him drink water and coffee, and kept the cabin warm despite the endless snow that piled against the walls outside. They talked during those long hours, the kind of deep conversations that might never have happened in town under normal circumstances. Frank told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father who had been a sheriff and died when Frank was 16, about drifting west after the war that had taken his older brother. He told her about becoming a deputy marshal at 23, about the satisfaction of tracking down men who preyed on the innocent, about the loneliness of a life spent mostly in the saddle. Emma listened with those green eyes fixed on his face, and when it was her turn, she told him about Pennsylvania coal country, about coming west with a husband she had barely known, married in haste to escape a father who drank too much. She spoke of her brief marriage without sentimentality, of learning to survive alone, of the pride she took in her independence even when winter nights were cold and empty. "You never think of going back east?" Frank asked on the 3rd day. He was sitting up now, propped against the wall with blankets wrapped around his shoulders. His back still hurt fiercely, but the fog of blood loss had lifted from his mind. Emma shook her head. She was sitting at the table, mending a tear in one of his shirts with the same neat stitches she had used on his flesh. "There is nothing back there for me. At least here I answer to no one. I have my cabin, my traps, my freedom. That is worth more than comfort or company." "But it must be hard," Frank pressed gently. "Winters like this, all alone." Emma set down the shirt and looked at him directly. "Of course it is hard, but hard does not mean wrong. I have made a life here on my own terms. That matters to me." Frank found himself admiring her fierce independence, even as something in him ached at the thought of her spending another winter alone in this cabin. He pushed the feeling aside, telling himself it was only gratitude making him feel protective of this woman who had saved his life. On the 4th day, Frank managed to stand and walk a few steps around the cabin before pain and dizziness forced him back down. Emma caught him before he could fall and guided him back to the blankets, her arm strong around his waist. When she had him settled again, she stayed close, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You are healing well," she said softly, "but you cannot push too hard. The wound was deep." Frank looked up at her and something passed between them, a spark of awareness that had been building since that first night. Emma pulled her hand back as if burned and stood quickly, turning away to busy herself at the stove. "More coffee?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Emma," Frank said, and she stopped but did not turn around. "Thank you for everything. I know I have said it before, but I mean it. You did not just save my life. You gave me something to hold on to when I was at my lowest." She did turn then, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You are welcome, Frank Nolan. I suppose it is nice to have someone to talk to again, even under such circumstances." The snow finally stopped on the 5th day, leaving the world outside transformed into a landscape of white drifts that sparkled under weak winter sunlight. Frank was well enough to sit at the table now, and he watched Emma prepare to check her trap lines with a mixture of concern and reluctant understanding. "I should go with you," he said, as she pulled on her coat and wrapped a thick scarf around her neck. "You should stay here and rest," Emma countered. "I have been running these lines alone for 2 years. I do not need help now. Those horse thieves could still be around." Emma picked up her rifle and checked that it was loaded. "Then they will regret finding me. I am a good shot, Frank. Better than my husband ever was." She left before he could argue further, and Frank spent the next 3 hours pacing the small cabin despite the pain in his back, starting at every sound, imagining a dozen different disasters. When Emma finally returned with 2 fat rabbits and a satisfied smile, relief washed through him so strongly it left him shaken. "See," she said, holding up her catch. "Perfectly safe." But Frank had realized something during those anxious hours. He cared about Emma Norton in a way that went far beyond gratitude or even friendship. The thought of anything happening to her had terrified him more than facing down armed outlaws ever had. He watched her skin and prepare the rabbits with practiced efficiency, watched the firelight play across her face, and knew he was in trouble. He was falling in love with her, this fierce, independent woman who had saved his life. And he had no idea if she felt anything similar, or if he was just another responsibility she had taken on and would be glad to be rid of once he was well enough to leave. That night, after a dinner of roasted rabbit and boiled potatoes, Emma asked Frank about his work as a deputy marshal. He told her about tracking outlaws across 3 states, about bringing in cattle rustlers and claim jumpers and men who robbed stages. He told her about the satisfaction of seeing justice done, but also about the weariness that had been growing in him over the past year. "I am 27 years old," he said quietly, staring into the fire. "Most men my age have wives and families. They have homes they go back to at night. I have a room in a boarding house in Council Bluffs and my life in a saddle bag. Sometimes I wonder what I am doing it all for." Emma was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "I think you do it because you believe in something bigger than yourself. That is rare, Frank. Most people only think of their own comfort." "And what do you believe in?" he asked, turning to look at her. "I believe in surviving, in making my own way, in not depending on anyone else for my happiness or my safety." But even as she said it, Emma's voice held a note of uncertainty, as if she was questioning beliefs she had held for years. The days settled into a rhythm. Frank's strength slowly returned as his body healed. He insisted on helping Emma with chores, splitting firewood despite her protests, hauling water from the partially frozen creek, checking and resetting traps near the cabin. They worked together in companionable silence, and sometimes Emma would start humming while she cooked, and Frank would catch himself smiling for no reason at all. 2 weeks after the stabbing, Frank removed his shirt so Emma could check the wound. Her fingers were gentle as they traced the angry red scar tissue, and Frank had to close his eyes against the sensation of her touch on his bare skin. "It is healing beautifully," Emma said, her voice slightly breathless. "You are lucky. Another inch to the left and the blade would have punctured your lung." "I am lucky you found me," Frank said. "I would be dead and frozen in a snowbank if not for you." Emma's hand stilled on his back. "I am glad I found you too." Frank turned to look at her over his shoulder and found her face very close to his, her eyes wide and dark in the firelight. The air between them seemed to thicken with possibility. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Frank reached up and touched her cheek. "Emma," he said softly, "I need to tell you something." But before he could continue, Emma stood abruptly and moved to the other side of the cabin. "You should put your shirt back on. It is getting cold." Frank did as she suggested, frustration and disappointment warring in his chest. He knew Emma felt something for him. He could see it in the way she looked at him when she thought he was not paying attention, in the way she found excuses to touch his arm or shoulder, in the flush that colored her cheeks when their eyes met. But she was fighting it, clinging to her independence like a shield against the vulnerability of caring for someone. That night, Frank lay awake on his blankets by the fire while Emma slept in her narrow bed across the room. He listened to her breathing and thought about the decision that was looming before him. His martial duties would call him back to Council Bluffs soon. He needed to report the attack, to continue tracking the horse thieves if the trail was not completely cold. But the thought of leaving this cabin, of leaving Emma, felt like tearing open the wound in his back all over again. He could ask her to come with him to town, to give up this isolated life and build something new together. But he knew her well enough now to understand that she would refuse. Emma had fought too hard for her independence to surrender it easily, even for love. And he would never forgive himself if he asked her to give up the life she had built just to follow him. The only answer, Frank realized as dawn light began to creep through the window, was to give her a reason to want something different. To show her that partnership did not mean losing herself, that love could make her stronger rather than weaker. But he would have to do it carefully, without pushing too hard or too fast. Over the following days, Frank began to subtly change the way he interacted with Emma. Instead of letting her do everything for him, he took over more of the cabin chores. He cooked breakfast while she was out checking traps. He cleaned and mended the snowshoes that had broken straps. He repaired the door that had been sticking. He did these things not to prove he was useful, but to show her that having someone share the burdens of daily life did not mean giving up control. Emma noticed, of course. She watched him with those sharp green eyes, suspicion, and something like hope warring on her face. One evening, after Frank had prepared dinner and they had eaten together by the fire, she finally addressed it directly. "You do not have to earn your keep," she said. "You were injured. I was just helping you heal." "I know that," Frank replied, "but it feels good to be useful again. And it feels right to take care of you the way you took care of me." Emma looked away. "I do not need taking care of. Everyone needs someone, Emma. There is no shame in that." She stood abruptly and grabbed her coat. "I need to check something outside." Frank let her go, understanding that she needed space to process what he was offering. Through the window, he watched her stand in the snow, arms wrapped around herself, staring up at the star-filled sky. After several minutes, she came back inside, her cheeks red from the cold. "I was married before," she said without preamble, "and my husband made every decision. What we ate, where we lived, who I could talk to. When he died, I swore I would never give that power to anyone again." Frank nodded slowly. "That was not a marriage, Emma. That was a prison. Real partnership means both people get a say. It means supporting each other without smothering. It means being stronger together than you ever could be alone. And how would you know?" The question was not unkind, just genuinely curious. "You said yourself you have never been married." "I grew up watching my parents," Frank said. "They were true partners in every sense. My father made decisions about his work as sheriff. My mother ran the house and the accounts. They consulted each other on everything important. They were equals. That is what marriage should look like." Emma sat down heavily in her chair. "I want to believe that is possible, but I am afraid, Frank. I am afraid of losing myself again." I know, Frank said gently, and I would never ask you to give up who you are. Your strength, your independence, your fire, those are the things I love about you. The words hung in the air between them, and Emma's eyes went wide. You love me. Frank had not meant to say it quite so plainly, but there was no taking it back now. Yes, I love you, Emma Norton. I think I started falling for you the moment I woke up and saw you sitting by my bedside, keeping watch. I love your courage and your skill and the way you face life head-on without flinching. I love that you saved a stranger's life without hesitation. I love talking with you by this fire. I love the way you hum when you are cooking. I just love you. Tears were streaming down Emma's face now, catching the firelight. I love you too, she whispered. God help me, I do. But I do not know how to do this, Frank. I do not know how to be with someone without losing myself. Frank stood and crossed to her chair, kneeling beside it so they were at eye level. Then we will figure it out together. We will make our own rules, find our own way. I am not asking you to give up this cabin or your traps or your independence. I am asking you to let me share your life, to build something with you instead of for you. Emma reached out and cupped his face in her hands, her touch achingly tender. What about your work? You are a deputy marshal. You cannot just give that up. I have been thinking about that, Frank admitted. The truth is, I am tired of the constant travel, the loneliness. I could work closer to Council Bluffs, take a position as a town deputy maybe, or even become a farmer or a rancher. As long as I am with you, the rest is just details. You would do that for me. I would do it for us, Frank corrected. For the life we could build together. Emma leaned forward and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears. I am terrified, Emma said honestly, but I want to try. With you, I want to try. They talked long into the night, making plans and dreaming about the future. Frank would return to Council Bluffs to formally resign his position as a traveling deputy and see about getting work closer to home. Emma would keep her cabin as a retreat, somewhere they could come when they needed solitude, but they would also look for a small piece of land closer to town where they could build a proper house. They would raise horses, Frank suggested, and Emma's eyes lit up at the idea. I always wanted animals, she said, but I could never manage more than a few rabbits alone. With two of us, we could really build something. As February turned to March and the snow began to melt, Frank's strength fully returned. The scar on his back was still tender, but he could move without pain, and the wound had healed cleanly thanks to Emma's skilled care. They knew their time alone in the cabin was coming to an end, that the real world would intrude soon enough with all its demands and complications. One morning, as they were eating breakfast and watching the sun rise through the window, Emma reached across the table and took Frank's hand. When we go back to town, she said quietly, people are going to talk. A widow living alone with a man, neither of us married. It will not be proper. Frank squeezed her hand. Then we will get married. If you want to, that is. I know we have not known each other long by conventional standards, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Emma smiled, that beautiful wide smile he had learned to treasure. I want to. Yes, Frank Nolan, I will marry you. They decided to wait until spring properly arrived before making the journey back to Council Bluffs. In the meantime, they continued living in their small bubble of happiness, working side by side, learning the rhythms of each other's lives. Frank taught Emma to shoot better, standing behind her and adjusting her aim until she could hit a tin can at 50 paces. Emma taught Frank to cook the way she had learned from her mother, turning simple ingredients into meals that tasted like home. At night, they lay by the fire talking and planning, sometimes kissing until they were both breathless, but always stopping before things could go further. Emma wanted to wait until they were properly married, and Frank respected that even when it cost him considerable self-control. "Soon," Emma would whisper against his lips. "Soon we will have all the time in the world." In late March, when the roads were finally clear enough for travel, they packed up supplies and prepared to return to civilization. Emma took one last walk around her cabin, touching the walls, the stove, the furniture that had been her whole world for 2 years. "Are you sure?" Frank asked softly. "We can stay longer if you need to." Emma shook her head. "No, I am ready. This place served its purpose. It kept me safe and gave me time to heal from my first marriage. But I am ready for something new now, for something better." They rode into Council Bluffs on a bright spring morning, Frank on a borrowed horse from a neighboring farm and Emma riding behind him with her arms wrapped around his waist. The town was bustling with activity after the long winter. Merchants opening their shops, children playing in the muddy streets, wagons rolling through on their way west. Frank's first stop was the marshal's office, where his boss, Marshal Henry Davidson, looked up from his desk with an expression of profound relief. "Nolan, we thought you were dead. You have been missing for 6 weeks." Frank explained about the ambush, the stabbing, and Emma's rescue. He left out some of the more personal details, but Davidson was sharp enough to read between the lines. When Frank finished by announcing his resignation, the marshal sighed heavily. "I figured as much when you walked in here looking at that woman the way you do. Cannot say I blame you. Life on the trail is no way to live long-term." Davidson stood and shook Frank's hand. "You are a good man, Nolan. If you ever need a reference or a favor, you let me know." Their next stop was the boarding house where Frank had been renting a room. The landlady, Mrs. Peterson, exclaimed over his miraculous survival and bustled around packing up his few possessions. When Frank mentioned he was getting married, she beamed with joy and insisted on helping Emma find a proper dress for the ceremony. The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church on Main Street. It was a simple affair with only a handful of witnesses, including Marshal Davidson and his wife, Mrs. Peterson, and the minister who had agreed to perform the ceremony on short notice. Emma wore a blue dress that Mrs. Peterson had altered to fit her, and she had woven wildflowers into her dark hair. Frank wore his best suit and could not stop staring at his bride. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Frank kissed Emma for the first time as her husband, he felt something settle deep in his chest, a sense of rightness he had never experienced before. This was where he was meant to be with this woman, building a life together. They spent their wedding night in a room at the boarding house, finally alone and legally joined. Emma's hands shook slightly as she undid the buttons of her dress, and Frank covered them with his own. "We do not have to rush," he said gently. "We have the rest of our lives." Emma looked up at him with trust and love shining in her green eyes. "I want this. I want you. I am just nervous. My first marriage was not, he never made me feel." Frank silenced her with a kiss. "This is just us now. No ghosts, no past, just you and me." He took his time, patient and tender, learning what made Emma gasp and sigh, showing her with his body what he had told her with words, that she was cherished, that she was an equal partner in everything, that her pleasure mattered as much as his own. When they finally came together, Emma cried out his name and held him like she would never let go. Afterward, lying tangled in the sheets with Emma's head on his chest, Frank felt a contentment so profound it almost frightened him. How close he had come to missing this, to dying in that snowstorm without ever knowing this kind of love. "What are you thinking?" Emma murmured sleepily. "That I need to find those horse thieves and thank them," Frank said, and Emma lifted her head to stare at him in confusion. "If they had not stabbed me, I never would have met you. They gave me the best thing that ever happened to me, even if they did not mean to." Emma laughed and swatted his chest. "You are absurd, but I love you anyway." Over the next few weeks, Frank and Emma worked tirelessly to build their new life. Frank took a job as a deputy in the Council Bluffs Sheriff's Office, working regular hours and coming home each night to Emma instead of sleeping under the stars or in dingy hotel rooms. Emma kept her trapping business but also started taking in sewing and mending work, using the skills her mother had taught her to earn extra money. They saved every penny, planning for the day when they could buy land and start their horse ranch. Emma proved to have a natural gift with animals, and by summer they had purchased 2 young mares from a farmer selling off his stock. They kept the horses in a rented stable and visited them daily, gentling them, training them, dreaming about the day when they would have a whole herd. Life was not always easy. Money was tight, and there were moments when Emma's old fears would resurface, when she would withdraw into herself and Frank would have to patiently coax her back out. There were also times when Frank chafed at the routine of town life, when he missed the freedom of the open trail. But they worked through each challenge together, talking things out, compromising, always remembering that they were partners in every sense. In the fall of 1879, they finally had enough saved to purchase 40 acres of land about 8 miles outside of Council Bluffs. The property came with a small house that needed considerable work, a barn that was slightly more sound than the house, and a creek that ran through the western edge of the land. It was perfect. They moved in on a crisp October morning, loading their few possessions into a borrowed wagon and driving out under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Emma cried when she first saw their new home, and Frank kissed away her tears. "It is just the beginning," he promised. "We are going to build something amazing here." And they did. Frank took leave from his deputy position to focus on repairs, and Emma worked beside him, learning carpentry and roof patching and a dozen other skills. They fixed the house first, making it weatherproof before winter could arrive. Then they turned their attention to the barn, building new stalls for the horses they planned to acquire. Their 2 mares, which Emma had named Daisy and Clover, were pregnant, having been bred before Frank purchased them. In early 1880, both gave birth to healthy foals, and suddenly they were in the horse business. Frank proved to have his father's eye for good bloodlines, and Emma's gentle training methods produced horses that were smart and willing. Word spread quickly, and by summer they had sold both foals for a tidy profit and had orders for 3 more. Life fell into a rhythm of hard work and deep satisfaction. Frank still worked as a deputy 2 days a week, enough to bring in steady money, but not so much that he was away from the ranch constantly. Emma managed the day-to-day operations, keeping meticulous records of breeding, training progress, and finances. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch they had built onto the front of the house, watching the sun set over their land, discussing plans for expansion and improvements. 2 years after their marriage, on a warm summer evening in 1880, Emma told Frank she was pregnant. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, and Emma clung to him with tears streaming down her face. "We are going to be parents," she said wonderingly. "I never thought with my first husband we tried but nothing ever happened, and I thought maybe I could not. Well, you obviously can," Frank said, setting her down gently and placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby, Emma, our baby." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Emma continued working the horses well into her 2nd trimester, only stopping when she became too large to comfortably mount. Frank took over the training, following her instructions to the letter, while Emma focused on preparing for the baby's arrival. She sewed tiny clothes and blankets, converting a corner of their bedroom into a nursery. Mrs. Peterson came out to visit regularly, bringing supplies and advice and endless enthusiasm. In February of 1881, 3 years almost to the day after Frank had been stabbed and Emma had saved his life, their son was born. The labor was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from town and Mrs. Peterson, and there were moments when Frank feared he might lose both Emma and the baby. But Emma was as strong as ever, and when dawn broke, she delivered a healthy boy with powerful lungs and a shock of dark hair. "What should we name him?" Emma asked, exhausted but radiant as she held their son. Frank thought of his father, the man who had taught him about justice and honor and treating people with respect. "What about William, after my father?" Emma smiled. "William Nolan, I like that. William Frank Nolan." "William Frank," Frank repeated, overcome with emotion as he looked at his wife and son. "That is perfect." Fatherhood changed Frank in ways he had not expected. The casual risks he had taken as a deputy suddenly felt reckless and irresponsible. He had a family now, people who depended on him, and he could not afford to be careless. 6 months after William was born, Frank resigned from the sheriff's office entirely to focus on the ranch full-time. The decision proved to be the right one. With both of them working the land, the horse business flourished. They expanded the barn, built better fencing, purchased 3 more mares and a truly excellent stallion. By 1883, they had a reputation throughout Iowa and into Nebraska for producing quality horses that were reliable, intelligent, and well-trained. William grew into a sturdy, cheerful child who toddled after his parents around the ranch, fascinated by the horses from the moment he could walk. Emma proved to be a patient, loving mother who somehow managed to balance childcare with running a business. Frank marveled at her constantly, at her strength and capability, and the way she had blossomed from the isolated, wary woman he had met in that frozen cabin. In the spring of 1884, Emma discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was met with calm happiness rather than shocked joy. They knew what to expect now, knew they could handle whatever came. Their daughter was born in November, a tiny perfect thing with Emma's green eyes and Frank's stubborn chin. They named her Grace, after Emma's mother. Life with 2 children was chaotic but full of love. William doted on his baby sister, bringing her flowers and trying to teach her to walk when she was barely 6 months old. The ranch continued to thrive, and they hired a young man named Tom to help with the daily work, freeing up more time for Frank and Emma to focus on the children and the breeding program. In the quiet moments, usually late at night after the children were asleep, Frank and Emma would sit together on their porch and marvel at how far they had come. From that desperate night in the blizzard to this a thriving ranch, healthy children, a love that had only deepened with time. "Do you ever think about that cabin?" Frank asked one evening. They still owned the property, though they rarely visited. Emma leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders. "Sometimes. It was my refuge when I needed one, but I do not need to hide anymore. This is my home now. With you, with our children. This is where I belong. We should show the kids someday," Frank suggested. "Tell them the whole story, how I got stabbed and you saved my life and we fell in love." Emma laughed softly. "They will probably think it is terribly dramatic and romantic. When they are older, anyway. Right now, William just wants to know if there are horses at the cabin. Everything comes back to horses with that boy." "He is your son," Emma pointed out. "You are the one who talks about bloodlines and confirmation at the dinner table." Frank grinned and pulled her closer. "And you are the one who spends hours teaching Grace the names of every plant on the property. She is barely 2 years old. She likes learning, Emma said defensively, but she was smiling. Besides, a woman should know about the land she lives on. It makes her strong. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch horses moving in the barn, an owl calling from the trees along the creek, the wind rustling through the prairie grass. Frank thought about the man he had been 6 years ago, lonely and directionless, despite his badge and his reputation. That man would not recognize the life he had now, would not believe that this much happiness was possible. As the years passed, the Nolan ranch became a landmark in the region. Their horses were sought after by ranchers and farmers across 3 states. William grew tall and capable, taking over more of the training work as he entered his teenage years. Grace proved to have her mother's gift for record-keeping and her father's eye for horseflesh, becoming an invaluable part of the business despite her young age. In 1890, when Emma was expecting their 3rd child, Frank began building an addition onto the house. At 40 years old, he was graying at the temples but still strong, still capable of a full day's work. Emma, at 36, remained as beautiful as ever, her face showing laugh lines and the marks of a life well lived but losing none of its essential vitality. Their 2nd son was born in the summer, an easy delivery compared to William's difficult entrance into the world. They named him James, and he completed their family in a way that felt absolutely right. William, now 10, took his role as big brother seriously, while 8-year-old Grace appointed herself the baby's guardian and refused to let him out of her sight. Frank stood on the porch one evening watching Emma play with their 3 children in the yard, and was struck by an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He touched the scar on his back, still visible after all these years, and said a silent prayer of thanks for the thieves who had stabbed him, for the blizzard that had driven him to Emma's cabin, for every twist of fate that had led him to this moment. Emma caught him watching and smiled, that same brilliant smile that had captured his heart in a frozen cabin 12 years ago. She handed baby James to William and crossed the yard to join Frank on the porch. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sliding her hand into his. "Everything," Frank said honestly. "How much I love you, how grateful I am for our life together, how glad I am that I got stabbed in a snowstorm." Emma laughed and shook her head. "Only you would be grateful for nearly dying." "I am grateful for what came after," Frank corrected. He pulled her close and kissed her, slow and deep and full of 12 years of love. When they broke apart, Emma was flushed and smiling. "The children," she protested weakly, "are busy playing," Frank finished. "Come inside with me for a minute." They slipped into the house, leaving the children under William's watchful eye, and Frank led Emma to their bedroom. He pulled her down onto the bed beside him, not for passion though that was always present between them, but simply to hold her, to breathe in the scent of her hair, to feel the solid reality of her in his arms. "I love you, Emma Nolan," he said quietly. "More than I did the day I married you, more than yesterday, less than I will tomorrow. You gave me everything: a home, a family, a purpose. You took a broken, bleeding man and made him whole." Emma's eyes were shining with tears. "And you gave me courage to trust again. You showed me that love does not have to mean losing myself. You made me believe in partnership and forever." She kissed him softly. "We saved each other, Frank. That night in the blizzard, we saved each other." They lay there together listening to their children's laughter drifting through the window, and Frank knew that no matter what else life brought, they would face it together. They had built something permanent and good, something that would outlast them both. Their children would inherit not just the ranch, but the legacy of what true partnership looked like, what love could create when 2 people were brave enough to trust each other completely. As the sun set over the Iowa prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Frank and Emma Nolan held each other close and counted their blessings. From a night of violence and desperation had come a lifetime of love. From a stranger bleeding in the snow had come a husband, a father, a partner in every sense. From a widow's lonely cabin had come a family, a ranch, a future. It was more than either of them had ever dared to dream, and it was everything they would ever need. Years continued to pass in the comfortable rhythm of ranch life. The children grew and changed, each developing their own personalities and strengths. William proved to be a natural horseman with an intuitive understanding of the animals that matched his mother's. By the time he was 16, he was handling sales and negotiations with buyers, his honest face and straightforward manner earning him trust and respect. Grace inherited both her parents' best qualities. Emma's quick mind and fierce independence combined with Frank's steady patience and strong moral compass. She kept the ranch's books with meticulous care and began experimenting with breeding programs that further improved their stock. Local ranchers learned quickly that trying to negotiate with 14-year-old Grace Nolan was like going up against a friendly but immovable force of nature. Young James, following in his older siblings' footsteps, showed early promise as a trainer. At 6 years old, he could already gentle a skittish colt with nothing but time and soft words, and the horses responded to him with remarkable trust. The Nolan Ranch prospered through the 1890s, weathering economic downturns and harsh winters through careful management, and the strong foundation Frank and Emma had built. They never forgot where they had come from or what they had survived to build their life together. Every winter, when the first serious snow fell, Emma and Frank would exchange a look full of shared memory and gratitude. In 1895, when William turned 19, he announced his intention to marry a young woman named Sarah from a neighboring ranch. Emma cried happy tears at the news while Frank clapped his son on the shoulder with fierce pride. The wedding took place in the spring, and the whole community turned out to celebrate. Watching William and Sarah exchange vows, Frank was transported back to his own wedding day, to the way Emma had looked in her blue dress with wildflowers in her hair. "They remind me of us," Emma whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "They do," Frank agreed. Young and hopeful and ready to build something together, William and Sarah built a house on the western edge of the Nolan property, and William continued working the ranch alongside his father. Within a year, Emma and Frank became grandparents for the first time when Sarah gave birth to twin boys. Holding his grandsons, Frank was overcome with emotion at the continuity of life, at the legacy he and Emma had created. Grace, meanwhile, showed no interest in marriage despite several young men's attempts to court her. At 17, she announced her intention to attend a new agricultural college in Ames, determined to learn the latest scientific approaches to horse breeding. Frank and Emma supported her decision wholeheartedly, proud of their daughter's ambition and intelligence. "She is just like you," Frank told Emma the night before Grace left for school, "strong and independent and determined to make her own way." Emma smiled through tears. "She is like both of us. She has your integrity and your vision for the future." James, at 11, declared that he would stay and help his parents run the ranch, a promise that made both Frank and Emma laugh with delight. Their family was growing and changing, but the core remained strong, built on love, trust, and the partnership that had begun in a frozen cabin so many years ago. In 1898, Frank and Emma made a trip back to the cabin for the first time in nearly a decade. It stood as it always had, weathered but solid, and they spent an afternoon cleaning and repairing, making sure it would stand for years to come. As they worked, they told each other stories, remembering those first desperate days and nights. "I was so afraid," Emma admitted as they sat on the cabin's small porch watching the sun set. "Afraid of caring for you, afraid of what it would mean if I let myself love again." "And now?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. "Now I cannot imagine my life any other way." "You were right, Frank. Partnership does not mean losing yourself. It means becoming more than you ever could be alone." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We should bring the grandchildren here someday, tell them the story." "The whole story," Frank teased. "Even the part where you threatened to leave me to die if I did not stay conscious," Emma laughed. "I never said that. You implied it very strongly," Frank insisted. "It was very motivating." They sat together as darkness fell. Two people who had been tested by hardship and had emerged stronger, their love deepened by time and trial. The cabin had served its purpose. It had brought them together and sheltered them while they built the foundation of their life. Now it stood as a monument to their beginning, a reminder of how far they had come. When they returned home the next day, it was to find William's twins, now 3 years old, racing around the yard while their mother tried in vain to corral them. Grace had sent a letter from college full of exciting news about new breeding techniques she was learning. James had successfully trained a particularly difficult horse that several older hands had given up on. The ranch was thriving, the family was healthy and happy, and Frank and Emma stood together watching it all with profound contentment. As the new century approached, bringing with it changes and challenges that no one could fully predict, the Nolan family faced the future with confidence born of experience. They had weathered storms both literal and figurative. They had built something lasting through hard work, faith in each other, and a love that had only grown stronger with time. On New Year's Eve 1899, Frank and Emma stood on their porch under a sky full of stars, surrounded by their children, their son's wife, and their grandchildren. As midnight approached and the century turned, Frank pulled Emma close and kissed her, tasting salt from happy tears on both their faces. "Here is to the next 100 years," he murmured against her lips. Emma smiled. "I will be long gone by then, my love. Then here is to the next 50. The next 20. The next day. As long as I have you, Emma, I have everything I need." They watched the fireworks that the neighboring ranches had set off, lighting up the prairie sky with brilliant colors. Their grandchildren shrieked with delight while William and Sarah held them safe. Grace, home from college for the holidays, stood with James, both of them smiling and pointing out particularly impressive explosions. This was their legacy, not just the successful ranch or the quality horses, but the family they had built, the love they had nurtured, the example they had set. The years that followed brought their share of challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, horses that got sick and crops that failed, the normal struggles of ranch life. But through it all, Frank and Emma faced each obstacle together, their partnership as strong as ever. They grew older gracefully, gray hair turning white, faces weathering like the prairie itself, but their love never dimmed. Grace graduated from college and returned home with revolutionary ideas about selective breeding and proper nutrition for horses. She took over much of the breeding program while Frank and Emma gradually stepped back, content to advise rather than direct. William and Sarah had 3 more children, filling the ranch with the sound of young voices and laughter. James, as promised, stayed close to home, eventually taking over the day-to-day training operations. In 1905, on their 24th wedding anniversary, Frank and Emma made one final trip to the cabin. They were older now, moving more slowly, but still fit enough for the 8-mile journey. They spent the afternoon there, just the two of them, sitting by the fire and remembering. "You have any regrets?" Emma asked as twilight fell. Frank considered the question seriously. "Not a single one. Every choice I made, every path I took led me to you. How could I regret any of it?" Emma nodded, satisfied. "I feel the same way. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed in the cabin that day, if I had decided not to brave the storm. You would have died, and I would never have known what I was missing. The thought terrifies me." "But you did brave the storm," Frank reminded her. "You saved me, and I spent the rest of my life being grateful for your courage." They made love that night in the cabin for the first time since their wedding night, gentle and familiar after more than 2 decades together, and it felt like coming full circle. This place that had witnessed the birth of their love now held this tender remembrance of it, a private moment between two people who had shared a lifetime. The ride home the next day was quiet and peaceful. They held hands when the trail was wide enough to ride side by side, and when they crested the final hill and saw their ranch spread out before them, the expanded house, the large barn, the horses grazing in the pastures, smoke rising from the chimneys, Frank felt a swell of pride and accomplishment so strong it brought tears to his eyes. "We did that," he said, gesturing at the scene before them. "We built that together from nothing, from love," Emma corrected. "We built it from love." They rode down the hill toward home, toward their children and grandchildren, toward the life they had created through trust and partnership and devotion. The sun was setting behind them, casting long shadows across the prairie, and ahead the windows of their house glowed warm with lamplight, promising welcome and warmth and belonging. Frank and Emma Nolan had started their journey together in darkness and cold, with Frank bleeding in the snow and Emma fighting to save his life. They had built something remarkable from that desperate beginning: a family, a legacy, a love story that would be told for generations. As they dismounted in front of their house and their grandchildren came running to greet them, as Grace emerged from the barn with news about a successful birth, as William called out that dinner was almost ready, Frank reached for Emma's hand one more time. She took it without hesitation, her grip still strong, her smile still capable of making his heart skip a beat. They had saved each other that night in the blizzard, and they continued saving each other every day since, from loneliness, from fear, from the belief that they had to face life alone. They had proven that love was not about losing yourself, but about finding yourself reflected in someone else's eyes. That partnership was not about submission, but about mutual support and respect, that the best things in life were worth fighting for, worth building, worth nurturing across decades. Their story, which began with violence and ended in peace, which started with desperation and culminated in abundance, was complete. And it was everything a love story should be: real, hard-won, and lasting. From a frozen cabin to a thriving ranch, from strangers to soulmates, from survival to triumph, Frank and Emma Nolan had written their own ending, and it was exactly as it should be: together, always together.